On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.
In the file, they will really see like the raw details of everything that happened, which is of course very painful. You can sometimes see situations where people were turned in for a few guilders.
That's some of the news coverage from a few weeks ago in January, when the Netherlands released a trove of historical documents, files from 1944 listing 425,000 names and records of Dutch people suspected of collaborating with the Nazis during the Second World War. The Netherlands government did it in the interests of transparency and coming to terms with the country's wartime past, even though it was controversial as it could cause distress for the accused's relatives and friends all these years later, and even though about a quarter of the names were later found by the courts not to be guilty. In contrast, here in Canada, despite years of prodding by human rights groups, especially B'nai Brith, our National Archives keeps resisting fully releasing all its historic documents on how many Nazi war criminals and collaborators got admitted to Canada after the war. Right now, the secret files with names and cases of a suspected 900 people are kept classified. There could be up to 2,000 even. These were first gathered in 1986 in a report done by historian Alti Rodal for Canada's Commission on Nazi War Criminals. Only part of her findings were ever published, and what were heavily redacted. Canada did prosecute a handful of elderly war criminals, but it didn't have much success, and in the ensuing 40 years, the whole issue has been dropped as a priority until 2023, when renewed public attention came before October 7th with the Yaroslav Hunka scandal, when Parliament gave him a standing ovation for the former soldier of the Ukrainian Waffen-SS. After that, Ottawa released a few more pages, but the key list of suspected criminals, and in total maybe 1 million pages, held at other departments like the RCMP, the Department of Justice, and Immigration, still a hard no. In November, the Library and Archives ruled that releasing the names would jeopardize Canada's relations with an allied country. They didn't say which, who gave Canada sensitive information all those years ago and still doesn't want it published. And releasing RCMP case file numbers, still no. So B'nai Brith has now gone to the federal court asking for a judicial review. The application was filed January 21st.
These documents are important for Canada and for all Canadians. It's not just a Jewish community interest that we have here. It's a much more larger historical interest.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Tuesday, February 18th, 2025. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News and made possible in part thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Canadian historian Howard Margolian wrote the book on whether Canada really was a safe haven for Nazi war criminals. It's called Unauthorized Entry. Margolian spent years working as a war crimes investigator in the Justice Department, and from his unique vantage point handling the files, he calculated that yes, Canada did let in former Nazi members, especially the Ukrainian Waffen-SS. But he argues they were low-level collaborators mostly, and he felt the government did a pretty good job of keeping a lot more really bad Nazis out. As Canada coped with the flood of over 1.5 million newcomers we took in under pressure from England right after the war. Margolian thinks releasing all the names now would be nice, but useless for historians unless we get all the pages showing what crimes they are suspected of having committed and all the context. For his part, human rights lawyer Sam Goldstein is adamant Canada must finally come to terms with its Second World War past. Goldstein worked as legal affairs director for B'nai Brith Canada on this file. They both join me now.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Howard.
Nice to meet you, too.
The Library and Archives Canada has turned down requests to have these files released to the public. There's several reasons why the decision was taken. Sam, let's start with you. You're B'nai Brith, former legal counsel. You were intimately involved in this. What did they say were the reasons that they can't release it to the public now in this time in our history?
So they denied the information on several sections underneath the Information Act. But by and large, the general reason for denying it has to deal primarily with the fact that the information that was obtained from a foreign government or a foreign investigative body or a foreign organization. So another reason is personal information. And I think and another reason is that an investigation underneath it may disclose investigation information underneath the law of Canada that's being currently investigated. But essentially, it comes underneath sort of a larger rubric of national interests. It's basically under that larger rubric that they don't want to release this information because it might offend a foreign government. B'nai Brith has been waiting for a response for about 2 years. We put in the initial request. The next step is that we appeal the decision to the Information Commissioner, and after the Information Commissioner Office of the Information Commissioner makes its decision, then that decision can then go to the Federal Court of Canada for an independent review, which we lawyers call judicial review. So we'll finally get before a person who's not a government employee. And that's where I think we should invest our greatest resources and energy and hope. And I'm not too surprised that we got the denial. I was obviously hopeful we would get the information, but I know that, and certainly the Globe has reported upon this earlier this year, that the request that B'nai Brith was making, and the Globe and Mail and the Daily Beast, which is a publication in the United States, were also people requesting this information, that CJA, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, has been undermining the efforts of getting this information by lobbying the government not to release it.
In fact, CJA did come out on the record and call for the files to be released in the principle of transparency. But CJA says any form of disclosure should be done with proper context to avoid a witch hunt in the court of public opinion. Howard, I'd like to have you jump in if you wouldn't mind, because when you wrote your book and you got access to files that maybe the Deschenes Report didn't have, because your book came out 2000, a few years later. Can you speak to what you were able to get?
At the time that, not only these members of what used to be the 14th SS Division, but other people, particularly from Eastern Europe after the Second World War, who were granted access who maybe shouldn't have been. The records that would have been available to RCMP security screening officers at various visa vetting offices in Europe were pretty much limited to, I guess, two main kinds of records. So German records in Germany, of which there were plenty, and then also International Refugee Organization records now housed in Paris at their National Archives, and that there were certainly efforts made to screen out people who would have been considered at that time undesirable. So people who had willingly volunteered, collaborated, people who had committed crimes. That was the general conclusion I reached. We always do better with the benefit of hindsight. And I was fortunate in that when in the 1990s, when I worked for a few years for the Department of Justice's War Crimes Unit, we got access to various archives, both in the former Soviet Union, but also in places like the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary. And there were a lot of captured German records. The Red Army, as it moved west, they certainly grabbed a lot of documents, anything that the Germans didn't burn or shred or whatever when they were retreating. the Soviet army obviously got a hold of and took back with them and basically kept under wraps until really the collapse of the Soviet bloc. When it came to people like these Ukrainians, some of whom I have no doubt, in fact, I have some evidence, were in auxiliary police units set up by the Germans when the Germans first got there. When they would try to apply, or anybody in any country, the Baltic countries, wherever, when they would try to apply to get a visa to come to Canada, we had a process, but that process would have run up against a wall in the case of people from what we now call, let's say, the Eastern Bloc, because the German records on them would have been sparse or non-existent. So the RCMP officers, the immigration officers at our various visa granting offices in Europe would have probably gone, and I know did go, to the German archives and try to get information on these people, but that became a fool's errand.
You said they ran up against a wall, but you had access because communism had been over, the wall had fallen when you were researching. So you got stuff that they couldn't get, is what I'm trying to say.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
So how did you come up with your number of 2,000 Nazi and other war criminals coming to Canada?
Well, that was, actually, that is an estimate, and it's based on a pretty broad definition. So it's not just war criminals, but it's basically people who, even at very low levels, would have either voluntarily joined units that the Germans set up, often initially in an ad hoc manner, or who subsequently, after 2 years of German occupation and being tired of kind of, having to do forced labor, if they were offered the opportunity to join some kind of, as I say, it usually was some kind of an auxiliary police unit, they did so.
How do we know who these people are that are in this list that Alti Rodel wrote, that the government had, that they're not telling us?
I haven't seen the names. I never read the second half, the secret half of the Deschenes Commission report. What I did do, particularly for my book, was to try and research the unit, the 14th SS. And of course, I was also interested in process. My book, a lot of people have said, is exceedingly boring because, of course, it's about bureaucratic processes. And I have to say, when I was doing the research, even I was finding sometimes that it became a bit of a snooze when, how many different visa application forms can you look at, from whether it's the Oslo office or the Berlin office or, the Frankfurt office or whatever, before you say, oh my God, what am I doing? But it was necessary to do that in order to try to understand the process.
Okay, so people that have reviewed your book have said that you said Canada's making it out to be a bigger problem than it actually was. Is it fair to say that your book says it wasn't so bad, that Canada didn't let in as many as people were?
I guess you could make the argument that we shouldn't have allowed any of them. But if you were going to have a resumption of immigration from various parts of the world after the Second World War, you were going to have criteria and processes for evaluating applications by these people. Considering the numbers of people who came to Canada, and I wrote basically about the first roughly 10 years after the war, even the number 2,000, and like I said, I think I was being a little more on the high side with that estimate, given the amount of immigration, given how difficult it was to screen people, particularly displaced persons from Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, I concluded ultimately, well, we really didn't do that bad a job. Could we have done better? Yes.
On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.
And of course, one of the mysteries, I guess, or at least one of the more open questions, which certainly even after 24 years after my book, is I don't know the precise type of screening that these 14th SS men got. I know what happened to them when they were first captured and then eventually, were allowed into Britain. I know what kind of screening they got there. But as far as what the Canadians did, I mean, I know what the Minister of Immigration at the time promised, and I know what they were doing with similar people, let's say ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe who had also ended up in other Waffen-SS units. But because I never saw the visa files, the visa vetting files for this particular group of people, I can't be 100. I had to infer that the Canadian authorities, the immigration and RCMP authorities, basically screened them the same way that they would have screened, people from other parts of the world who may or may not have been collaborators with the Germans in their respective countries. I had to make a formal request to get access to files of people who had been in other Waffen-SS units and who we knew had been rejected. These were people who we know never got into the country, so they may have been members of a Baltic SS unit or one of the Hungarian or Yugoslavian SS units. So I got to see a number of those. And by the way, when I got them, of course, the names were blanked out, because I was told at the time, and I suspect perhaps Mr. Goldstein can speak to this, that the Access to Information Act, Section 17, I think it is, which was about names, the government could not release, even though these people, to my way of thinking, the ones who were rejected from admission, why they had any expectation of privacy, I do not know, but I was told by the archivist that these names had to be kept confidential. I could not find out their names for, I believe it was until 110 years after the date of their birth or 20 years after the date of their death.
The section's actually 17, and what 17 is about is it says you don't disclose names of people where the names where the information could reasonably be expected to threaten the safety of individuals. I don't know how people who have passed away are going to be, how their safety could be threatened. I think that just sort of goes to show that the Library and Archives Canada just used every exemption they possibly could to deny the disclosure. But I think the important point that Howard's making on the big level is the fact that history is nuanced. It's not black and white. There's a lot of gray in it. And the comments he's making are interesting because we have to know what happened in Canada. We have to know what it's a Canadian story. It's a Canadian story about what we did after World War II. And it's important to know what we did and to put what our actions into context with other people. One version of why we accepted these Nazi war criminals and collaborators was because at the time, during World War II, the greatest threat to national security, everyone's security in Canada, were Nazis. After the war, that wasn't the issue. Nazism had been defeated, and the greater threat to our nation and to the world was communism. And we have a specific example where I believe it's in Alti Rodell's narrative of what happened, the historical narrative, was that Canada let in a Yugoslavian Nazi who would then knew the language, then what was Yugoslavia, knew the language and was able to spy on Yugoslavian communists. So it's an important story to tell about our own country that we need to know. And in terms of the names, I know it's not just about the names. I mean, to ask those questions about how we fit into world history and how do we assess our leaders at the time, because one of the ways of assessing a prime minister or elected officials' status in the pantheon of Canadian history, so to speak, is to go back and look at their actions, and we have to know what happened at the time. And in order to do that, we have to have the context and the history to properly judge them. And that's another reason why we need to sort of get these information. But the names are important too. The names will not just a name, Joe Doe isn't that important in and of itself, but it would lead to, I think, the other sort of legal aspects of getting information that Howard is looking at. And for sure, getting hold of the other documents like the screening process are just as important to tell that full story of history.
One of the interesting things was that while there was a tremendous amount of pressure exerted on the Canadian government, beginning really in 1947 and continuing until the government makes the decision that, yes, we'll let in a certain number of these 14th SS people, despite this incredible pressure coming from various Ukrainian Canadian organizations, that was ultimately not what sort of changed the policy. What happened was the Canadian government was working through internally, okay, we're coming nearer and nearer to a peace treaty with what became West Germany, which eventually happened in 1951. And so we are thinking of relaxing some of the restrictions, or in effect the ban, on ethnic Germans who may have served in the German armed forces or in other more odious units, let's say. And so they were coming up with processes and revamping some of the criteria to allow that. And this happens before, while the Canadian government is basically telling the Ukrainian Canadian organizations to go jump in a lake, stop bugging us about this, we're not letting them in. But once they opened the door a crack for non-German members of the Waffen-SS from other countries, it was inevitable, whether it was right or not, I'm not commenting on, but it was inevitable that they were going to have to do the same with the 14th SS. As a historian, I have to say, I'm really not interested in getting names. What I would be much more interested in is seeing the visa vetting files on all 950 or 1,000, however many were allowed in, of these 14th SS division people, because I think that would speak to what Mr. Goldstein just mentioned before about, did the government do a reasonable job at screening these people, or did they not? I was able with some groups to say, yes, they did. But because I never got to see the files on these people, I have no real way of knowing if the government's, as I said, assurances, given including in the House of Commons, that, oh, yes, these fellows will be subjected to the most stringent kinds of screening we can do. To me, releasing the names without having context to it, particularly that context, why were they allowed in? Did they lie on their visa application forms? And it was simply, as I have suggested, impossible for the Canadian government to always challenge the lie? Or did the Canadian government basically say, you know what, we're not going to devote a lot of resources to these people according to the British and according to the Ukrainian Canadian community? These are mostly, good guys who just kind of got swept up in and were recruited, often not voluntarily. That would have been their argument. I would beg to differ, but and so I would like to know the answer to that more than I would want 1,000 names.
What do you make of the fact that it's divided the community, and the Canadian broader non-Jewish community is also divided on it? The Holocaust survivors want it. You guys want it. The Ukrainian Canadians said they would sue and go to court and try to block it.
It's unfortunate that our government, primarily Trudeau's government, plays a domestic politics and tries to pit community groups against community groups at large.
The whole argument was that right now Canada is an ally of Ukraine, and as soon as these aims would be released, I should say, then it gives fodder to Putin in modern day conflicts to say, you see, the Ukrainians were Nazis. We're right to denazify Ukraine. So there's a more modern war at stake here. This is the argument I've been hearing.
Well, I think how I'm going to answer that. I'm sorry. I think you could walk and chew gum at the same time. I think you could be critical of countries and both be supportive of them at the same time. So I don't see that they're mutually exclusive. That's not how we should talk about this issue. We should talk about in terms of a Canadian, important Canadian story.
Howard, you're still there?
I
Do one
I
more.
am.
You mentioned that there were very tight restrictions on the actual German Nazi members, and you said that just earlier. Do we know how many really bad people were, and I'm putting bad in quotation marks, came in? You said you didn't see the files, but you must have for Waffen, but you saw other files, right?
Bad is a very subjective word. One of the documents, which was from at the time, 1950, after the then Minister of Immigration came out and said, well, if they meet other admission criteria, we may let some of these 14th SS people in. The Canadian Jewish Congress was not happy with this, and they responded essentially by writing to the then Minister of Immigration and saying, really, what's the point in screening if you're just going to screen individuals without accepting the totality of the evidence against this division? Mr. Goldstein, Sam, just talked about history as nuanced. And the history of this particular division is nuanced. If you take the position that anyone who ever served in an SS unit, in this case, the armed SS or military SS, militarized SS, Waffen SS, just by doing that, they should automatically and for all time have not been granted admission to Canada, then okay, that's a position. I don't even happen to agree with that, but that's a position. It's not nuanced, it's a position. We are taking the position that there is nothing that can mitigate their service for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, whatever it was in this unit, even if we later found out that a particular individual, that all he did was stand guard at a training camp for this division for 3 years. And what I found when I particularly this is one case because it was a large number of people who were to be admitted in fairly short order. This was a very interesting test case of Canada's attempts to screen out Nazis. And what I found when I researched this was I had the advantage of being able to go into some pretty arcane documentation about let's say the precursors to this particular division, some of the auxiliary police units, some of the reports by the precursors of these units as to what they were doing. And it was pretty clear to me, and it's why I said in my book, I think that when the Deschenes Commission basically gave them this division a relatively clean bill of health, they didn't have access to the documentation that I subsequently got access to. I found that yes, there were criminal elements certainly in the precursor units to this division. The division was formed in 1943. They did some training. The two training camps that they were trained at were both near, in one case in Poland, near forced labor camps, in another case in Czechoslovakia at that time. They were near Flossenburg concentration camp. I couldn't find direct evidence of the 14th SS's involvement in those labor camps or in Flossenburg concentration camp, but it would not have been unusual for people who were training to possibly have done some duty in one of these places. Certainly there was evidence in the case of anti-partisan operations that some elements took part in some pretty horrible atrocities against civilians. But it's a mixed bag. Part of the problem, of course, is that the division had about 14,000, I think, at full strength. It goes into battle in July 1944. It's almost wiped out. About 3,000 escape either being killed or captured by the Red Army. and they are then the nucleus of its second incarnation. So it's entirely possible that since about 75% of the division was effectively wiped out, and since those people probably didn't come to Canada, it's entirely possible that yes, there were criminal elements who were killed in combat or taken prisoner by the Red Army. So that's the nuance I'm talking about, and that's why I guess you might be hearing I am somewhat reluctant to simply release names, because if you release names without their files, what you're basically saying is, well, it's a Waffen SS unit. We should never allow any of these people come in, regardless of their individual behavior. And I guess that's the kind of nuance that I think Sam is talking about. And it's certainly the kind of nuance I attempted in my book. If the government can release the names, or at least the names according to their own section, I guess he said it was 17 of the Access to Information Act, so release them. But to me, the names are not telling any kind of a story by themselves. I would be more interested to know, did we let in, I don't know, of the 1,000, did we let in 150 or 200, and I'm guessing here, who may have had prior service in auxiliary police units, which had committed one form or another of what we would call atrocities or war crimes.
But what about the broader number of who got in? So who are the rest?
In the case of Ukrainian collaborators, they would have probably been people who served in auxiliary police units, or who there was a training camp for SS guards called Travniki in Poland. And a lot of Ukrainians, including, by the way, John Demjanjuk, the famous or infamous one, ended up, and they really didn't do much in the way of rounding up Jews. Occasionally they did. They were sent into the Warsaw Ghetto, and on April 19th, they were unceremoniously thrown out by poorly armed Jews, shooting at them from buildings and rooftops. They were primarily camp guards. So they would have been sent to various, including Sobibor, Treblinka, or more forced labor camps, places like Flossenburg and others. There were a few French collaborators. There was this individual that Sam Goldstein referred to, who had been a member of the security police apparatus in German-occupied Yugoslavia. We even allowed a few lower level, I guess, German scientists to come here. There was a smaller group of people, Poles, who came right after the war and were supposed to be temporarily admitted. I believe many of them were able eventually to get permanent status. They were actually screened quite well, according to my research. And they were basically Poles, often of ethnic German origin, who were conscripted into the German armed forces late in the war. I mean, a lot of this does happen later in the war when the Germans are losing and they are trying to replenish dwindling manpower, and so yeah, they're taking anybody who will happily join them, and if people won't happily join them, sometimes they're forcing them to join them.
Not to say that lower level didn't murder Jews or other things.
Well, they did. I mean, we know they did.
Right.
I saw documentation from some countries where all you needed to do was put two and two together. You'd see a German police report on what an auxiliary police unit from Lithuania, and they would write, you didn't know for sure, but they would write how many bullets this 120-man unit had expended. And then if you marry that to the fact that on that day there was a mass execution of Jews near Riga, Latvia, or wherever, or somewhere in Lithuania, you could kind of draw a reasonable assumption, yeah, these guys were involved. These low-level kinds of killers, some of the people we let in would have been people like this. Absolutely. This was not deliberate malfeasance on the part of the Canadian government. And I don't even think it was incompetence. It was, again, if somebody was in a displaced persons camp after the war, they usually were screened even to be allowed to stay not by Canadians, but by whether they were British or American or whatever. They would have been screened. Some would have been rejected. But exactly what information the International Refugee Organization, which was sponsoring these people, would have had on them, of course, you'd have to look at their individual file. And all that the Canadians could do is then ask for that. If this person then came to a Canadian visa vetting office and said, I want to go to Canada as an individual, I'm not talking now about the 14th SS, and the Canadian RCMP screening officer would probably ask a bunch of questions. If that person passed that, then the RCMP officer would then check out his answers by trying to get whatever documentation he could. The problem with the process came with, what do you do when there isn't that kind of documentation?
And you also said they lied.
It was not a perfect system. I would say, just given the volume, particularly the numbers of people, the tens of thousands of people who we did allow in, who were International Refugee Organization sponsored, people from Eastern Europe, I think we actually did a pretty good job.
It's time to write volume 2 about what's happened in the last 25 years, now that you can get all this stuff. I mean, I know you're retired, but there you go.
There aren't really Nazi war crimes prosecutions going on anymore. I think Germany last year did prosecute somebody, but I mean, basically these have stopped because there's almost none of these people left alive. And if they are alive, they're 98 years old and probably not capable of standing any kind of trial. One of the things they might want to do is see to what extent they can get access to the actual war crimes files of the war crimes unit, of which I was a member for a few years. I don't know. I suspect those will be kept under wraps for a long time. But I think if you don't try to, you'll never know what might be released and what might not.
I know the whole ask has always been for all the files. They want everything, as has been said, so we know what Canadian history was like and what we can learn from it, as opposed to for prosecution, because that, you said, that ship has sailed. So you know names, and are they in, some of the names are in your book?
Yeah, there's a couple of places where I got access to a file. Let's say it was from some archive in Poland, and there was an individual mentioned, but part of the agreement was that, and this is me as a private researcher, that I would not disclose the full name. Right?
So your book doesn't have names
in other cases, I really didn't see. I didn't see names, and in fact, as I said, with those CSIS records, but when I got the files, the names were blacked out without the context of what did the Canadian government know about, what did that, for example, this Jaroslav Hunka, the guy who got the standing ovation, right? What did they know about him? He obviously got in. We know he was a member of the 14th SS. I think he was pretty young when he was recruited for the 14th SS, so I don't know whether he would have been able to have also been in an auxiliary police unit in 1941, 42, before the division was formed. But it would be interesting to know. I just don't see the point in only having names.
Well, I hope we get some before our lifetime too, because I would like to know too, as a historian myself.
Nice hearing you speak.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily, made possible in part thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Now, that standing ovation in the House of Commons for Jaroslav Hunka did have a ripple effect. The University of Alberta returned a $30,000 endowment from the Hunka family in his honor. The Governor-General announced she regretted the Order of Canada went to that university's former chancellor, who had also been one of the suspected Ukrainian Waffen-SS. And thanks to renewed attention to Ottawa's $7 million national memorial to the victims of communism that was opened in December, the 4,000 name plaques weren't added on. As it's been discovered, some of the proposed names were also former Nazi soldiers. The Daily's senior producer is Zachary Judah Kaufman. Our executive producer is Michael Freeman, and our music is by Dov Beck-Levine. Thanks for listening.
On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments, Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.